Hello, innovators. I'm Todd Weyandt, and welcome to the Bridging the Gap podcast presented by Applied Software. You're invited to join our MEP and Construction Innovation Adventure with the mission to propel this great industry forward. My guest today is Jennifer Byrne. She's a veteran of the tech industry, most recently as the CTO of Microsoft's US division. She understands the business of technology and is also an advocate for the future of work. Welcome to the show, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited to dive into a lot of different topics here, but let's start with how you got into the tech industry to begin with.
Well, it was a windy path for me. I actually started, way back when in nonprofit and social services, and made a move into tech in the late '90s because it was the industry that was just had the most growth and the most opportunity. So a little career change, and ended up as an information security analyst working for government clients for a long time, and then moved into some of the bigger companies. Most of my time was in cybersecurity, and I just got to know the business of technology from an engineering and a systems perspective, and then a strategy perspective and a sales perspective. But the first move was not unlike a lot of the moves that we're seeing into technology today, where it just has a level of opportunity for people from a salary and a growth perspective that you're just not seeing in other industries. So it was a practical move that paid off really well for me.
Yeah, nice. What was it like working your way up through Microsoft and everything?
Well, I joined Microsoft in 2014 as the chief security officer for the public sector group. And that was because I'd had a long career in cybersecurity. And so I wouldn't say I worked my way up. I worked my way across the company, up a little bit, and then largely across. I joined when there were significant security concerns around the adoption of public cloud, mostly in countries outside of the US or non-US countries. And so I spent a couple of years talking about policy and regulation and the relative security and benefit of using cloud as opposed to having your data stored on site, which was a big conversation back then. Yeah. And then I moved into a CTO role, and the challenge was that the Microsoft portfolio was so big and broad that you couldn't possibly be an expert in any particular technology, right? There's too much of it. And so you have to learn how to get to the right altitude and think very strategically. And what I eventually learned is the real key to that job is to spend less time understanding technology and more time understanding the problems that you're trying to get technology to solve. So you become more of an expert in your customers and the industries they live in. And from there, you have the context to understand how to apply technology. And that's the key to transformation, which is what really is expected of a CTO, to think very strategically about how technology can change the future. So it was a wild ride. I loved it. And it was an opportunity to really dive deeply into a lot of areas that I wouldn't have otherwise had the opportunity to do.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, it definitely all comes back to people in the end. You can't embrace technology without first getting the people on board and ready to embrace the technology.
Absolutely.
One of the things that I want to pick your brain on before we move on is with your background of kind of the cloud and cyber security. Obviously that's become a hot button topic as of late with all the cyber attacks. How has that world kind of changed or grown over the last couple of years?
Well, it's interesting because some things change and a lot of things stay the same. I have to say that back in the early 2000s, I was working for Symantec, and back then the big product that people bought was antivirus software. And from an antivirus vendor perspective, every year we'd look at these charts and the growth of malware and attacks, and just wonder, is this going to last? Or do you think everyone's going to kind of figure this out and this whole security thing is going to go away? And it's so funny how naive we were back then, because every year, the growth in the level of complexity of technology just opened up opportunities to, bigger attack surface to attack. So it's just been a growing market. And the underlying problems that companies had that prevented them from really developing a very secure posture really haven't changed in many ways. There's not a great business model for securing technology. Oftentimes it's looked at as like an insurance policy. We're going to go spend millions of dollars on security technology, but what does it really give us in return? There's a risk reward question that executives have. And so, so that business model behind security has always been a little bit dubious. And so, people leave themselves open to attack, or, just can't find the means to secure themselves. And that gives opportunity to, cyber attackers. And so that kind of, it hasn't changed a lot from that perspective. It's always been a tricky business model. Meanwhile, the complexity of technology is such that, every time you introduce something new, you digitize a new process, you create a new opportunity for an attacker, right? So we have opened up the floodgates for cyber criminals to, be very creative in their tactics and their techniques to, in terms of stealing data or doing all sorts of other malicious things. And so there's a ton of innovation there. I think the finest point on that is to say that cybersecurity professionals have all sorts of limitations around what they can do, because you have to operate in the context of the business, but a hacker has no rules. So we call this kind of asymmetric warfare, where the attacker has, sort of free reign and ability to do whatever they want. Yet the people who are protecting networks are actually fairly constrained. And so it's just going to be this sort of age-old problem that will be, I don't see an end to it. But hopefully people in general get much more sophisticated, and there's a growing awareness of the level of investment that people need to make in order to keep themselves secure.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really interesting. Yeah, I think the awareness play is huge on that. You just think twice before you open something or click on something. Will solve. Obviously, that's not the silver bullet, but that'll solve a lot if people just kind of second guess themselves before they click on stuff.
Absolutely.
Well, let's dive into the future of work. Obviously, people's day-to-day has changed over the last 18 months and what the situational aspect of work looks like. But looking at the future of work, what do you think that really is going to look like over the next couple of years?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think there are a couple different perspectives to take on that. But to start, I do think this conversation that we're having right now, the hot button conversation around remote versus hybrid versus in office, I think that's the kind of the prevailing conversation right now. And I expect that will go away. I expect that we will settle that question in the next year or two. Business doesn't like to operate in uncertainty. So while we are right now in a phase where everyone's trying to figure out what jobs can be remote, what jobs have to be hybrid, what jobs have to be in an office, I think we're going to make those decisions and people will settle into the roles. And there'll continue to be some shift probably over the next year or two. But generally speaking, I think we'll land ourselves in a place where we just have a much better feeling for how work can best be done, and people will settle themselves into positions that work for them personally and professionally. I think the lasting issue that the pandemic accelerated, but was already in place, is that there's so much change in the workforce. Jobs that are going to be here in 5 years haven't even been invented yet, and so from a employer or employee/worker perspective, I think people are going to stop looking at their careers as one big monolithic thing. Like, I am an accountant and I will be an accountant until I retire. I am a marketing person, I will be a marketing person until I retire, because the world isn't going to stay the same. So those jobs are going to shift. And hopefully what happens is that people start to say, I am a person and I have a lot of skills that I can apply in a lot of different ways in a lot of different industries. And my career is not so much one big thing as it is a series of adventures, hopefully, that I take along the way. And I have a constant ability and need to innovate myself and my own brand and my skills and my experience and apply that to whatever comes next, because the world is becoming a more and more uncertain place. So I think from an employer perspective, what that means is that we will start to hopefully think about character attributes and basic skills more than very specific skills, because the specific skills get deprecated pretty quickly. Like, if you learn a technology today, that technology might not be in use in 2 years. And so how important it is that your job candidates know that specific thing. Rather, you want them to know the underlying skill that supports something more discrete. And so I think we'll see employers and hiring managers start to have an appetite for looking at novel skills, character attributes. They won't care about 10 years of experience in a single thing. They'll rather want to see 2 to 3 years of experience in a lot of different areas. So they'll look for people who have agility as much as they have expertise.
Yeah, that's really interesting. In some research on you before syncing up today, I saw that you had written that the word career kind of needs to go away. And I thought that was really interesting. You kind of unpacked that just there. But so how do you make that mental shift in going away with career mentality and trying to kind of open up and also kind of syncing back to something that you said at the beginning with your experience of Microsoft as having to learn kind of the underlying problems of the technology instead of knowing the specific technologies. How do you go about that mental shift? Because that's going to be probably not intuitive to a lot of people, I would imagine.
Yeah, I don't think it is intuitive. And you're asking a great question, because I think it is actually a hard thing to do. And when we think about, you asked me, what do I think is going to change in the kind of future workspace? I think that is a change that's starting to happen. So I don't think there's an answer yet. I think we're all going to have to figure this out as we go along. But one, where a good starting point is really just changing your own mindset around what's important to you and your own values. Like if we have all, even sort of the youngest among us, have been raised in an environment where school is this very sequential thing. We are studying to be a certain thing like that. A career is still held forth as something that is an aspiration for us to have. And so just becoming aware of the fact that that might not serve you to be able to do a certain thing, and changing your own internal value system around what's going to be important for you in your own life. Would you rather look back and say, I did a bunch of things? So there's some setups that you have to do sort of in yourself. That's one thing. I think the other is being really curious about all the adjacent skills and the environment you're operating in. One of the most important things that happened for me at Microsoft was when I committed to becoming a student of the industries that I was supporting, right? So I had to shift my focus from, am I going to learn the ins and outs of artificial intelligence, or I'm going to learn how the healthcare ecosystem works? You have to become curious about the environment around you and think about what you do, and then the adjacent skills that support that, and become a little bit broader in your, sort of in your own kind of learning path, if you will. There's a lot there, though. I mean, we're all kind of in experimenting mode. And I'm always excited when I see people who decide to take a 6-week coding boot camp, or decide to go back and get a certification in design thinking, or whatever it is. It's kind of a skill that's slightly outside of what you'd expect them to do, because I think what they're doing is building kind of a robustness in their own career, and they giving themselves an ability to be a little bit more agile, so they can shift and move, as the workforce or the economy changes.
Yeah. So is the onus then on the employee to kind of spark and develop that curiosity, find their passion, and push the company to allow them that flexibility? Or is it more on the company to train kind of that problem solving mentality and help foster that environment among their people?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, it seems like the right answer would be the employer, right? Like, we'd like to think that it should be companies that take care of their employees, but yeah, to be very realistic about, there's two things. I mean, companies, if we are saying in general that this notion of career is going away, then you're sort of implying that the notion of tenure is also maybe changing a little bit. Like, you can't, and for a company to invest in your education, they're going to assume they have you in a certain job for a minimum period of time. But if we're saying, well, hang on a second, Todd might want to do something completely different next year, or, he might want to reinvent himself and move into a different department. It does change the investment model for companies to invest in employees, and not that they shouldn't, but just to call out, some very valid constraints that employers have in that retraining, kind of in the business model of retraining. So it's a yes and answer. I think employers need to think about that. There's also employee acquisition is expensive. And so if you can keep retention high, even if you've got lateral movement of your employees across different divisions, that's still oftentimes less expensive than always bringing in new people. And so some level of upskill, reskill is going to be important for employers to offer. It's going to be hard for them to do that because of the model. It will also be hard for them to do that because one of the things I discovered in having this conversation with a lot of, chief people officers or HR executives is that they don't themselves know what their sort of the demographics, or not the demographics, but their job profiles will look like in 5 years, right? They're going to go undertake massive digital transformation projects and automate big pieces of their business. Well, what is that going to mean for the kinds of employees that they'll need in 5 years? So how do you train for a future that is, not
murky.
Quite clear? Yeah, it's murky, exactly. So you have to have this shared responsibility where people also take it upon themselves to think about what it is they'd like to do and continue to demonstrate a willingness and an enthusiasm around learning. A lot of times, I know at Microsoft, I hired lots and lots of people, and you don't always get the perfect fit from a candidate perspective. But one thing that always swung in favor of yes for me was when people demonstrated a passion for learning. Somebody has like 1,000 certifications, or you can just tell that they took every opportunity in front of them to learn something new. So that just that kind of ownership of your own career path is itself a really nice thing to have in a job market.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's both. And I think the onus is on the employee, but also the employer to embrace that mindset shift. And I don't think it's as threatening to employers to invest in their employees in whatever passion that they have, because I think that in the long run, employers will find that by taking that deliberate time to invest in employees' passions, that they're going to stay because the culture aspect is so good and strong and vibrant. And I see that as one of the big drives and pulls in today's world, that people are going to go to those healthy, strong cultural environments rather than like, here's my exact career path for the next 30 years, all perfectly laid out. They want those, that corporate culture is huge. Does that make sense?
I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. I think it's hard for a lot of executives to get there because it's really hard to measure the return on that. So I think that's the point that I wanted to make. But in the end, we've got a younger workforce coming in. They have a very different set of expectations, and culture is a big part of that. So if you aren't making meaningful moves toward a better culture, you're going to have a hard time recruiting people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, to shift back to the employee side of things and their responsibility of it, communication, self-discipline, and then being able to collaborate with others are three big important factors of that. How do you encourage people to focus on getting better in those areas?
Well, to start with communication, I think there are a couple of things that are sort of contextual to this environment where we have more people working from home. Because communication is very different when everyone's in the office together than it is when we're all in different. We may not be remote, but we're remote from each other, right? And one thing I always or have felt over the last year that has been lost is that the serendipity of a chance encounter, right? It's you get to a meeting 5 minutes early, sit down at the conference room table, and you're sitting next to somebody you don't know, and you introduce yourself, and all of a sudden, you're having this really interesting conversation about a project going on in your company you didn't know anything about, and you learn something, and then you make a friend, right? Or you're walking down the hallway and you run into somebody you worked with 2 years ago, and they have a little bit of info for you. And it's just that the chance encounters that happen when people are in close physical proximity that I think we've lost. And you have the luxury in an office situation of not having to think about that 2 minutes or that 5 minute increment. You just have them. And you do learn, like they have value, and we don't have that when we're remote. And so what would I do to kind of replicate that? I think you have to embrace distraction. You have to embrace interruption. You have to embrace kind of the little Teams chat that shows up and, those conversations, because that's the proxy for the hallway, or the coffee machine conversation that you used to have in the office. And those minutes have meaning, right? Yeah. So it's embracing a lot of that. You can get into this tunnel vision view when you're working from home, you're just on your computer and you've got nothing. And so every distraction feels like literally something that is, has negative value. And I would counter that it actually has positive value. But the other thing is that, one of the pieces of advice I used to give to new people joining Microsoft, because it's a company of 100 and something thousand people, and it's easy to get lost. I would say, in every interaction you are in, every meeting, every conversation, always try to do a bit of an assessment of the unique value you bring in that conversation or in that meeting, which means you have to look around the table or the virtual table and figure out what everyone else is doing. And then from there, you have the context for what you bring. And maybe you bring financial skills in that meeting. Maybe you bring de facto leadership in that meeting. Maybe you bring a novel point of view. But if you can know why you're there, then you can get very effective in the way you communicate and what you communicate. So I think that is a skill that gets more important when we are remote and we have less opportunity to actually come together. When we come together, we have to really be mindful of how to make that valuable. And the first thing you can do is just to think about your value and what you bring. So that's communication. You talked about self-discipline too, and that's really interesting because that's hard. But I've always admired people, and you see this a lot with executives, who always seem to be operating in the context of their personal plan. Like people who are very ambitious and very focused and goal-oriented often will develop an idea of what they want for themselves and a plan for how they're going to get there, the skills they need to develop, the people they need to meet, all of that. And when they do that very effectively, every single thing they do is operating in the context of that plan. They know why they're doing what they're doing because it's part of their plan. And I think that's a key to self-discipline, because I don't think people necessarily are lazy or don't want to do work. I think oftentimes they just don't know what to do. And so if you can always be really grounded in the why of who you are and what you're trying to accomplish, then every little task starts to make sense for you and how you do that. But the other piece of self-discipline, which gets harder in the pandemic, is this notion of accountability, right? When you're in an office or in a cubicle setting, you can tell who's not working. Right. We don't have that anymore. So we have a lot of opportunities to not do work. So I think keeping yourself very accountable to what you are doing, and accountability extends not just to yourself, but to other people, is super important. And one quick question you can ask yourself is, how willing would you be to share your calendar? Are you willing to open your calendar up to your manager, to your manager's manager, to your teammates? Because if you aren't, you know what I mean? Like if you are willing to do that, then you're going to be really accountable for what you're doing every single day. So just that it's a mindset trick to, make sure that, you actually really do feel good about what you're, the effort you're putting in every day.
Yeah. I like that. The word that keeps popping up while you're talking is intentionality across both aspects of them, the communication and the self-discipline. I think that we've gotten the gift to practice intentionality over the last year and a half, because you have to be more focused on when you have those opportunities for communication. Don't waste it. Be intentional on it. When you have that opportunity on the calendar, be intentional of what you're putting on there, and don't have a lot of, wasted time necessarily where you're off just kind of doing whatever. So I think that's a big word. Yeah, I think so. And then you asked about collaboration, and that's a tricky one, right? Because innovation requires collaboration. And collaboration is tough in any scenario, right? Because typically you're working with people who are sharing ideas. There's a level of vulnerability there, right? Failure is a big sort of an unavoidable consequence of collaborating on big projects. And so people often come to those situations where they're kind of their fingers poised on the off switch. You know what I mean? Like they're like, I want to share an idea, but at any time I'm ready to hop out, like to turn off here because I'm sensitive to, the criticism that might come. And so
fostering collaboration with others, I think is, first of all, it's a mindset, but it's also a mindset that translates into the language that you use. And the word I like to use, or the phrase I like to use, is yes and. It's always something. If somebody's got an idea, they're, putting forth something, it may not be the best idea. It may not be complete. It may not be appropriate, but there's always a level of goodness. There's always something in an idea that's worth it. And the ability to say, yes, I love that. I love that because of these three things. And, is a way to just use language to shift the perception, of what has meaning in a meeting, even, if it's not perfect. Right. So there's a bunch of stuff that we can do if we start with the intention of making sure we keep everybody kind of at the table.
Yeah, absolutely. I talk a lot about redefining what failure means to that aspect of it. That if you don't try something, in my mind, that's failing. Where if you try something and it didn't go according to plan, well, that's life. That happens sometimes. Not everything's going to be home run, but you can learn from those experiences a lot, and that can help educate you for next time, so you don't make that same mistake and you can keep getting better. So it's that continual improvement line that I think is more important than not trying something.
Yeah, I completely agree. And the other thing that's interesting about failure, and curious what you think about this, I don't know that we know how to measure failure as success.
Yeah.
But I mean, we really only, in the context of a project or a program or business in general, we absolutely know how to measure success. But if we're saying we want people to fail, how are we giving them credit for failures?
Yeah. Well, it's a tricky concept because you don't know the success of the failure until the next time when you've learned from that mistake, but then it gets counted as a success on the next project. And I think we don't take the time to loop back of, this was a success because I learned from this failure over here. Instead, we just take credit for that success and we move on.
Right. But it's kind of a missing link, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't thought about that before, but yeah, you're spot on, I think. Well, shifting to technology adoption, how do you gain buy-in for new technology from people that may have a more kind of natural reluctance to technology and or really just change?
Yeah, well, I think if we had that question, the world would look very different, right? I mean, in my experience at Microsoft and really in all technology companies that I've worked at, that's the biggest issue, right? It's never the sponsors of the technology of your problem. It's that, the sponsors are typically in the minority, and there are a lot more people who, to use your word, have a reluctance for adoption. So, in my experience, there are things that you can do. I mean, there is a process to address that. The first thing, and it sounds so obvious, but it actually doesn't happen very often, is that you have to give a lot of space in the beginning of a project for all the reluctance that you hear. We don't want to do that. The instinct is to, kind of give it lip service, but try to move it to the side as quickly as possible because it's our project and we love it. And we actually don't know if it's going to work, but we really want to try. And so, you're trying to move the no votes out of the room as fast as possible. And it can be a good short-term strategy, but it's a terrible long-term strategy because all that stuff comes back to bite you if you don't address it up front. So, and actually the reluctance, the objections that if you give them some air and give people the space to talk about them, they become very helpful later on in the projects. But the first thing is to, find a place in yourself that allows you to give all that as much space as possible and let people just talk about it. From there, I think the response to those objections, which is the why, right? Which itself is really, really, really important. If people, and again, it seems obvious, but I've seen so many big projects not be clear on why, right? It's not fully articulated. And it's not that it's not articulated from a certain team or person's perspective. What always happens is that people don't articulate the why from another person's perspective. Like I get why from, you're an engineer, of course you want this solution, but I'm a finance person and I don't get it. So tell me the why for me. And that's a hard thing to do. But if you can get to the why, then as you're giving space for people to talk about their concerns, their objections, their overall reluctance, their dislike of technology, you can always bring that back to the why, and you can iterate on the why as well, and also the solution. So it's not just why we want to do it, but what is it going to look like if we are successful? And so again, they seem like nuts and bolts things, but oftentimes that doesn't happen. From there, it gets kind of complicated, because the other hitch in this process is that oftentimes we don't think end to end about a problem. Like there's no business of any respectable size that isn't itself a very complex ecosystem of process and technology and people, all sorts of other business constraints, and it's all connected. So when you are trying to solve a problem, oftentimes it's just not possible without a big multidisciplinary team for you to think very end to end about the root cause of the problem, all of the kind of antecedents of the problem, and then the solution in the middle of it, and then all of the consequences of the solution. Like, how are you going to change, other pieces of your business as a result of, the thing you want to do today? And so that's really the end-to-end view. And so when I said like the reluctances, the objections are really important to collect in the beginning, this is where they come in handy, because almost always those objections is because somebody thought about a different part, like they're in that end-to-end supply chain of problem. They're just in a little piece over here in the middle, or, they're kind of thinking about an unintended consequence at the end. And it forces you to be very, very holistic, right? Yeah. And that's how you get to robust solution. But the problem with that is that it gets really big. That's when you get scope creep and everything gets really big and unmeasurable and you can't do anything. So there's an art to being end to end, but then also being discrete and peeling off a very, very simple or a small part of a problem. Like you're only going to do a solution for one location or for a certain segment of employees. So you're thinking end to end, but just you're also thinking about something that's small enough to be measurable.
Yeah. Interesting. So are there kind of specific essential foundational building blocks for a successful technology adoption in your experience?
I mean, there's a bunch of stuff, but I think the three that I think of, it's a shared understanding of why you're doing it. There's a shared understanding of the outcome, what it looks like. Like you've got to have some kind of North Star. There'll be a lot of innovation and, sort of changes in the middle of the project. It's a windy path and kind of an unknown path, but as long as you know where you're going, that's important. And then the third one is a shared sense of urgency, right? Everyone has to feel like this problem has to get solved in a agreed upon timeline. And if you can do that, if you can have the shared sense of why and outcome and urgency, I think you have the right foundation to move forward.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I think it goes back to a storytelling element as well, too, that you have to tell the story of what's in it for them to each individual stakeholder group that is affected and involved in whatever you're trying to change and to innovate, to get that buy-in and get them not only just bought in and begrudgingly doing it, but excited in the process too. And that's when you start seeing some more success in it.
Yeah. People want to be part of the solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you could kind of snap your fingers and innovate one thing in the tech industry, what would it be?
I would innovate access to digital skills. I think the solutions are all, the technology only exists to serve us, right? It's a human thing at the end of the day. And so there's no shortage of problems to be solved. There's only a shortage of people to solve them. And how do we fix that? And we give them skills they don't have today. Yeah,
very nice. Well, how do people find out more information and connect with you?
Yeah, I mean, my biggest, I have a website, but I get a lot of reach outs on LinkedIn. And that's where I spend a lot of my time. So I would just go Jennifer Byrne at LinkedIn and find me there.
Sounds good. Well, last question for you. What does innovation mean to you?
Innovation to me means a fresh look at an old problem. So nice. It's a reinvention of what we thought was possible.
Yeah, I like it. Jennifer, thanks so much. I wish we could keep going on talking and unpacking all this stuff. This is This has been great. Thanks so much for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me, Todd. It's been super fun.
Absolutely.